The Galactic Confederation had been running the known universe with the efficiency of a well-oiled machine for approximately 7,000 years, which sounds impressive until you realize that most of its member species live for about 300 years and spend at least half that time in bureaucratic committee meetings. The Confederation prided itself on order, hierarchy, and an extensively detailed classification system that ranked every spacefaring civilization on a scale from Type 0 to Type 7, with subsections, amendments, and footnotes that would make ancient Earth tax codes look like light reading. At the top of this cosmic food chain sat the HFY, the species of energy beings who had transcended physical form roughly 4 millennia ago, and now spent most of their time contemplating the nature of existence and occasionally condescending to materialize for important votes. Just below them were the Draken hegemony, a reptilian species whose concept of patience was measured in centuries and whose warships could crack planets like eggs. Then came the Nexari collective, hive-minded insectoids with computing power that made quantum processors look like abacuses, and the Feldorian Empire, aquatic beings who had somehow mastered space travel despite finding the very concept of empty vacuum philosophically disturbing. And then, at the very bottom of the list, somewhere between adorably primitive and how are they not extinct yet, sat humanity. Earth had stumbled into the galactic community roughly 40 years ago when a HFY scout vessel had detected what they initially classified as concerning levels of nuclear fission, and investigated, only to discover that humans had barely figured out how to leave their own planet and were already arguing about who owned which parts of their moon. The Confederation had debated for 6 months about whether to even acknowledge humanity's existence or just wait for them to inevitably blow themselves up. Eventually, they decided that ignoring a species with nuclear weapons and absolutely no impulse control was probably a bad idea, and extended an invitation to join the galactic community with the kind of enthusiasm typically reserved for inviting distant relatives to wedding. Humanity's classification as a Type 1-3 civilization was, according to official reports, generous. The Confederation had created an entirely new subcategory called pre-rational industrialists, just to avoid placing humans in the same tier as species that still communicated through interpretive dance. Earth's contribution to galactic society consisted primarily of confusing the other species with their concept of fiction, introducing several troubling new food combinations that violated multiple health codes, and asking an uncomfortable number of questions about whether everyone else had tried just talking to their problems before building world-ending weapons. The other species tolerated humanity, the way one tolerates a puppy that keeps urinating on expensive furniture, with a mixture of exasperation and a vague hope that they would eventually grow out of it. The Draken found humans exhaustingly emotional. The Nexari could not comprehend why a species would need 8 hours of unconsciousness daily when their hive mind never slept. The Feldorians were deeply concerned about humanity's inexplicable fondness for living on land and avoiding water. The HFY simply found the whole situation beneath their notice, which was their default response to most things. For their part, humans were absolutely thrilled to discover they were not alone in the universe, right up until they realized that galactic community meant 7,000 years of parliamentary procedure and advanced civilization translated to incredibly boring. Earth's representatives at the Confederation quickly discovered that proposing anything took approximately 15 years of committee review, that all the good planets were already claimed, and that humanity's military technology was considered so primitive that the Confederation had classified their warships under recreational vessels alongside pleasure yachts and civilian transports. Human military vessels were admittedly not impressive by galactic standards. They still used chemical propulsion for maneuvering. Their energy shields were powered by fusion reactors that the Draken had stopped using 3,000 years ago, and their primary weapons were mass drivers, essentially fancy cannons that threw metal really. The Confederation's military observers had filed reports describing Earth's fleet as charmingly retro and suitable for light piracy deterrence perhaps. This cosmic pecking order had remained comfortably stable for decades, with humanity slowly learning galactic trade routes, occasionally violating cultural taboos through sheer ignorance, and generally being treated like the universe's awkward younger sibling. The Confederation's various species had their disagreements, their territorial disputes, their philosophical differences, but these were all handled through proper diplomatic channels, which meant they took centuries to resolve and everyone involved could feel smugly superior about their civility. Then the Voidborn arrived, and suddenly nobody felt smug about anything. The Voidborn were not a species in any traditional sense. They were a collective consciousness that consumed matter, energy, and disturbingly information itself. They did not communicate, negotiate, or even seem to acknowledge that other forms of life were anything more than resources to be absorbed. They had been steadily consuming the outer rim sectors for nearly a decade, moving through space like a locust swarm made of nightmares and physics violations. Entire civilizations had simply vanished, their worlds left as lifeless husks drifting through space. The Confederation had initially responded with their traditional approach. They formed committees, commissioned studies, and held lengthy debates about the philosophical implications of encountering a truly hostile intelligence. By the time they had finished arguing about whether the Voidborn even qualified as life under Confederation legal definitions, 17 colony worlds had been consumed and the threat had become too large to ignore. War was declared with all the gravitas and ceremony that 7,000 years of civilization could muster. The Confederation's combined fleets assembled, representing the greatest military force ever gathered in known space. The Draken brought their planet crackers, massive dreadnoughts that could reduce worlds to asteroid fields. The Nexari deployed their drone swarms, billions of autonomous fighters controlled by hive minds that could process tactical data faster than most species could think. The Feldorians contributed their phase-shift cruisers, vessels that could slip between dimensions to strike from impossible angles. Even the Atathari materialized their ancient warships, vessels of pure energy that could unmake matter with a thought. It was magnificent. It was awe-inspiring. It was, according to initial projections, absolutely sufficient to repel the Voidborn threat and restore order to the galaxy. The humans, naturally, wanted to help. Earth's fleet, such as it was, consisted of 42 combat vessels that the Confederation's military analysts had rated somewhere between adequate for system defense and please don't embarrass yourself. But humanity had this unfortunate tendency to get involved in things that were clearly above their technological weight class, driven by a combination of enthusiasm, naivety, and what the Draken had clinically diagnosed as species-wide suicidal overconfidence. The Confederation's high command faced a dilemma. They could not actually refuse humanity's offer to contribute without violating their own treaties about collective defense. However, giving humans anything resembling an important assignment seemed like an excellent way to lose valuable territory to a combination of Voidborn assault and human incompetence. The solution, reached after several weeks of debate, was diplomatically elegant and militarily practical. Give humanity a posting so strategically relevant that even human-level chaos could not significantly impact the war effort. Thus, humanity received its assignment with great ceremony and absolutely no actual importance. They were to establish a defensive position in the outer reaches, a sparse sector of space that contained nothing but a few dead worlds, some asteroid fields, and a decommissioned mining station that nobody had bothered to visit in 200 years. It was, the High Command assured Earth's eager military leaders, a vital position that would protect the Confederation's flank and serve as an early warning post. What the High Command did not mention, because nobody had bothered to check the astrological surveys from 3 centuries ago, was that the sector also contained an ancient wormhole nexus that connected to 14 major trade routes and half the Confederation's core world. The nexus had been considered dormant for so long that it had literally been left off recent star charts, filed away in archives that nobody read anymore. This oversight would in approximately 6 weeks turn out to be rather important. The human fleet arrived at their assigned sector with the kind of enthusiasm that made the Confederation's observers deeply uncomfortable. Most species treated minor defensive postings as tedious assignments to be endured with quiet dignity. Humans treated it like they had just been handed the keys to the galaxy's most exclusive nightclub and immediately started rearranging the furniture. Within 72 hours of arrival, the decommissioned mining station had been converted into a forward operating base that violated at least 6 different construction safety protocols. The humans had apparently decided that structural integrity guidelines were suggestions rather than requirements, and had begun welding additional modules onto the station with what the monitoring drones could only describe as aggressive. They installed sensor arrays pointing in every direction, established patrol routes that covered 3 times the recommended area, and began mining the asteroid fields for raw materials with the kind of industrial efficiency that would have impressed the Nexari if anyone had been paying attention. Commander Huang, The human fleet's commanding officer was a woman who had spent 30 years in Earth's Navy before first contact and had responded to the discovery of alien life by immediately asking if they needed help with anything. She was precisely the kind of person who treated strategically irrelevant backwater posting as a personal challenge. Her second-in-command, a grizzled veteran named Castellan, had the unsettling habit of treating every situation like it was 5 seconds away from catastrophe, which his crew found paranoid right up until it repeatedly saved their lives. The Confederation's liaison officer, a Drekken named Ixthor, who had drawn the assignment through bureaucratic misfortune, filed weekly reports describing the humans' activities with increasing bewilderment. They have established defensive positions at coordinates that defend nothing, one report noted. They are conducting combat drills as if expecting immediate assault. They have somehow manufactured additional ammunition using asteroid materials and equipment that should not be capable of such production. I do not understand their purpose, but they appear very committed to it. The rest of the Confederation's forces, meanwhile, were engaged in proper military operations. The main battle fleets had established defensive lines across 12 sectors, protecting high-value systems and industrial world. The Drekken positioned their dreadnoughts at strategic choke points where their overwhelming firepower could repel any assault. The Nexeri deployed their drone swarms in elaborate patterns calculated by quantum probability matrices. The Feldorians phased their vessels into defensive positions that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. It was textbook galactic warfare, executed with the precision of species who had been perfecting such strategies for millennia. The humans, lacking any such sophistication, simply fortified everything they could see and prepared for the worst. They strung the asteroid fields with improvised mines built from mining charges and proximity sensors. They positioned their ships in overlapping formations that would allow for mutual fire support. They even began constructing what appeared to be kinetic launch platforms using the mining stations or processing equipment, which technically violated 3 different weapons treaties, but which nobody bothered to mention because surely humanity's primitive kinetic weapons posed no actual threat to anything important. 5 weeks into the deployment, Ixthor filed a report that expressed concern about human psychological stability. They are behaving as if war is imminent at their location specifically, the report stated. Despite repeated assurance that the Voidborn's trajectory places them nowhere near this sector, humans continue fortification efforts. Multiple crew members have stated they have bad feeling about them. When pressed for tactical reasoning, they reference Murphy's Law, which appears to be a human philosophical concept stating that anything capable of going wrong will inevitably do so at the worst possible moment. I do not believe this constitutes valid military intelligence. The Confederation High Command reviewed the report, found it mildly amusing, and promptly forgot about it. They had actual strategic concerns to address, like the fact that the Voidborn had begun demonstrating uncomfortable adaptability to Confederation tactics. The entity had started splitting into multiple formations, probing different sectors simultaneously, learning from each engagement. Current projections suggested the war would last another 3 years minimum, a timeline that everyone found acceptable if not ideal. Then, on day 41 of the deployment, sensors detected a spatial anomaly in the human-occupied sector. The ancient wormhole nexus, dormant for 3 centuries, suddenly activated with enough energy to light up every detection grid within 20 light-years. And through that nexus, like nightmares pouring through a forgotten door, came the largest Voidborn fleet yet observed. The entity had somehow located the nexus, mapped its connections, and recognized it for exactly what the Confederation had forgotten: a direct route to the core world, bypassing the Confederation's carefully positioned defensive lines entirely. 300 Voidborn vessels, each one a writhing mass of consumed matter and stolen technology, emerged directly into what was supposed to be the galaxy's most strategically irrelevant sector, directly into the face of 42 human warships that had spent 5 weeks preparing for exactly this kind of impossible scenario. Commander Huang's first transmission to Confederation High Command was admirably concise. "So, about that quiet posting you promised, we're going to need reinforcements, probably a lot of them. Also, we're not retreating, so you might want to hurry." The Confederation's response, after approximately 15 seconds of stunned silence, was equally concise. "Hold position. Reinforcements in estimated arrival, 14 hours. Castellan, standing beside Huang on the command deck, did some quick mental mathematics and then said what everyone was thinking. We're not going to last 14 hours. Huang smiled, and it was not a comforting expression. Then I guess we'd better be creative. The Voidborn fleet moved through space like oil spreading across water, each vessel a grotesque amalgamation of consumed ships and technologies from dozens of extinct civilizations. They did not maneuver with the precision of military formations or the elegance of trained fleets. They simply advanced, inexorable and hungry, confident in the knowledge that nothing in this forgotten sector could possibly threaten them. They had not accounted for the fact that humans, as a species, had built their entire civilization on the principle of threatening things that should not be threatenable. The first Voidborn vessel to enter weapons range disintegrated in a spectacular fashion that confused every tactical analyst monitoring the battle. Human mass drivers, those primitive kinetic weapons that threw metal really hard, had been firing continuously for approximately 30 seconds before impact, not at the Voidborn ships, which were still out of effective range, but at carefully calculated vectors in empty space. 300 tungsten slugs, each weighing several tons and moving at significant fractions of light speed, had been positioned in a kill zone that the Voidborn fleet flew directly into. Physics, which cares nothing for technological sophistication, did what physics does. The lead Voidborn vessel intersected with 17 slugs simultaneously, and converted all that kinetic energy into a brief new sun. The explosion was visible from 3 systems away. Ixthor, watching from the mining station's command center because his observation vessel had been conscripted as additional defensive assets, filed what would become the war's most read after-action report. The humans are fighting incorrectly. They are not engaging in tactical combat. They are committing acts of industrial violence. Commander Huang's battle plan, if it could be called that, appeared to have been designed by someone who had never read a military manual and considered this a strategic advantage. Human vessels were not holding defensive formations or engaging in calculated fleet maneuver. They were moving in patterns that seemed almost random until you realized they were herding the Voidborn fleet into increasingly confined vectors, forcing them through choke points created by asteroid fields, debris zones, and the humans' own discarded equipment. The Voidborn adapted, as they always did, splitting their fleet to avoid concentration. The humans adapted faster, which should have been impossible given that they lacked hive mind coordination or quantum computing. They simply started doing things that no tactical database had ever recorded as viable combat strategy. When Voidborn vessels began flanking around the asteroid field, human ships loaded their cargo bays with mining explosives and reactor cores set to overload, then piloted directly into the enemy formation before the crews evacuated via emergency pods. 6 human vessels were lost this way. They took 43 Voidborn ships with them. When the Voidborn began deploying boarding organisms designed to consume ships from within, the humans vented entire sections of their vessels into space, explosive decompression turning their own crews into projectiles along with the invading entity. Then they sealed the breaches with emergency foam and kept fighting. Casualty rates were horrific. Nobody retreated. Castellan had established what he called contingency protocols, which was military terminology for increasingly desperate plans. Protocol 7 involved ramming. Protocol 11 involved overloading the mining station's fusion reactors and using it as a bomb. Protocol 16 was simply labeled evacuate remaining personnel and prey, which Ixthor found deeply troubling because it implied there were 15 worse options before prayer. The battle's 4th hour marked when the Confederation's monitoring assets realized that humans understood acceptable losses differently than every other species. The Draken considered 20% casualties catastrophic. The Nexari would withdraw drone swarms at 30% losses to preserve hive computing capacity. The Feldorians had complex philosophical frameworks about proportional sacrifice. Humans apparently considered acceptable losses to be however many it takes, and were approaching 50% casualties without even discussing withdrawal. One human destroyer, its engines crippled and weapons exhausted, continued fighting by using its maneuvering thrusters to spin rapidly while ejecting every piece of non-essential equipment as improvised projectiles. Crew quarters, furniture, food storage containers, even the captain's personal belongings became weapons. The Voidborn vessel attempting to board it was eventually destroyed by what the logs recorded as approximately 4 tons of military rations, assorted personal effects, and one decorative plant in a ceramic pot. By hour 7, the tactical situation had devolved into what military historians would later classify as absolute chaos, with a subcategory of terrifying human ingenuity. The mining station's ore processing system had been converted into a mass accelerator that launched refined metals at percentages of light speed. Human fighters were conducting attack runs at speeds that exceeded their structural tolerance, simply accepting that some percentage would disintegrate from stress, and considering this an acceptable trade-off. One enterprising crew had managed to hijack a void-borne vessel's control systems using what they described as very aggressive hacking and a fundamental disregard for software security. The void-borne, for the first time in recorded history, appeared confused. They had consumed thousands of worlds, absorbed hundreds of civilizations, and never encountered resistance that looked like this. Every species they had fought attempted to preserve their forces, minimize casualties, and retreat when disadvantaged. Humans just kept attacking, adapting, and improvising weapons from anything available, including, in one memorable instance, their own damaged vessel. Commander Huang, her flagship now missing its entire port side and operating on emergency power, continued coordinating the defense while standing on a command deck open to hard vacuum because the atmospheric containment had failed and nobody had time to fix it. Her crew wore emergency suits and kept working. When questioned later about combat effectiveness in such conditions, she would respond, "We were motivated." Hour 12 marked the arrival of human reinforcements, which was to say that every civilian vessel in Earth's merchant fleet had armed themselves with whatever they could mount to a hull and jumped to the sector. Cargo haulers with mining lasers, colony ships with improvised missile pods, even a passenger liner whose crew had apparently decided that their point defense systems could be used offensively if you were brave enough. The Confederation's military observers filed reports noting that this violated every regulation about civilian vessel armament, but nobody seemed inclined to mention this to the humans currently using a cruise ship to ram void-borne destroyers. The void-borne fleet, which had begun the engagement with 300 vessels and absolute confidence, was now down to 147 ships, and appeared to be attempting to retreat. This was unprecedented. The void-borne did not retreat. They consumed or were consumed, with no middle ground. Humans, naturally, decided that retreat was unacceptable and began pursuit, which caused Ixthor to file an emergency transmission. "The humans are chasing them. The humans are chasing them. Please advise. Please, for all our sakes, advise." Hour 14 arrived with the Confederation's reinforcement fleet, emerging from faster-than-light travel to discover a battlefield that resembled a debris field more than a combat zone. Human vessels, or what remained of them, were still engaged with the last void-borne ship. The mining station was somehow still operational despite missing approximately 60% of its structure. And in the center of everything, Commander Huang's flagship was locked in close combat with the void-borne fleet's command vessel, both ships tearing each other apart in a mutual embrace that would have been beautiful if it had not been so horrifying. The Draken fleet commander, arriving to save the primitive humans from inevitable destruction, instead found himself watching humanity save the galaxy through sheer refusal to acknowledge they should have lost. His official report would state, "We did not reinforce the human position. We simply arrived in time to witness their victory. I do not have adequate words for what I observed. I am not certain adequate words exist." When the last void-borne vessel was destroyed, 38 hours after the battle began, 19 human ships remained operational out of the original 42. Casualty rates exceeded 60%. By any rational military assessment, humanity had been devastated. Commander Huang's transmission to the Confederation fleet was characteristically succinct. "Sector secured. We could use some medical assistance and probably some new ships. Also, does anyone have coffee? We're completely out." The Confederation High Command spent 3 days reviewing combat footage before anyone could formulate a coherent response. The Atari, who had not expressed strong opinions about anything in roughly a millennium, materialized specifically to watch the recordings and then remained manifested for 6 straight hours in what other species interpreted as profound contemplation or possibly existential crisis. The Draken military analysts filed reports, deleted them, filed new reports, and then requisitioned significantly more potent recreational substances than they typically consume. The Nexari hive minds processed the tactical data and concluded that human combat doctrine violated approximately 40% of established military theory, with the remaining 60% being classified as technically possible but statistically improbable to the point of absurdity. The Feldorians, philosophical as always, simply noted that humanity had introduced the concept of spite as a valid military strategy and refused to elaborate further. The immediate problem facing the Confederation was that humanity now occupied the most strategically critical position in known space, held it with a tenacity that frightened every military planner who reviewed the battle data, and showed absolutely no inclination to leave. The wormhole nexus, forgotten for centuries, was now the galaxy's most important choke point. Any fleet attempting to reach the core worlds would have to go through human-controlled space, and humanity had just demonstrated what happened to fleets that tried. The political scrambling began approximately 6 hours after the battle ended, which was actually impressive response time for the Confederation's bureaucracy. The Draken hegemony, recognizing military capability when it punched them in their conceptual face, immediately proposed a formal alliance with Earth. The Nexari Collective offered to share computing technology in exchange for military cooperation agreement. The Feldorian Empire, with characteristic aquatic caution, suggested a mutual defense pact with extensive legal protections for both parties, and at least 17 years of negotiation about specific terms. Even the Atari descended from their energy being's superiority to acknowledge that perhaps humanity's classification as Type 1-3 had been, in their eternal wisdom, slightly miscalculated. Earth's diplomatic corps, which had spent 40 years being patronized by species who treated them like clever children, suddenly found themselves fielding offers from governments that previously would not have returned their communication. Humanity's representatives discovered that strategically invaluable military asset translated to significantly better negotiating positions than adorably primitive newcomers. Trade agreements that had been stalled in committee for decades were suddenly approved within weeks. Technology transfers that had been deemed inappropriate for human development level were abruptly reconsidered. Several colony worlds that humanity had requested access to, only to be told they were reserved for more advanced civilizations, were now available for settlement with extremely favorable terms. Commander Huang, who had been promoted 3 times in 4 days, and now held a rank that did not previously exist in human military structure, attended the Confederation High Command's emergency strategic session, still wearing a pressure suit, because her dress uniform had been destroyed when her flagship's atmospheric containment failed. She sat among military leaders from species that had been spacefaring for millennia, and listened to them debate the new galactic strategic paradigm with the expression of someone who had not slept in 5 days, and was operating purely on coffee and vindication. When asked for humanity's strategic assessment of the ongoing void-born threat, she provided analysis that made several Draken admirals visibly uncomfortable. They can be beaten, they adapt, but they adapt to logical tactics. Stop being logic. They expect preservation of forces and strategic withdrawal. Give them violence and commitment instead. They consume technology to improve their capabilities. Stop letting them consume anything. Destroy every void-born vessel completely. No retreat, no survivors, no mercy. The Feldorian representative delicately suggested that such an approach seemed excessively aggressive and potentially unsustainable, given casualty projections. Huang's response entered Confederation Military Academy curricula within the year. Unsustainable assumes we stop. We will not stop. Sustainable is a word used by species who plan to lose slowly. We plan to win quickly. The Nexari hive mind calculated probability matrices for human strategic doctrine and returned error messages, which they had not done in 6,000 years of military operation. When pressed for analysis, they simply stated, human combat effectiveness scales proportionally with desperation and inversely with survival probability. This should not work. This cannot work. This works. Humanity's demands for their new position as the galaxy's most critical defensive asset were surprisingly reasonable, which somehow made the other species more nervous than if they had demanded entire sectors. Earth wanted access to advanced propulsion technology, specifically faster than light drives that did not require 3 weeks of preparation time. They wanted defensive shield technology that functioned better than their current fusion-powered version. They wanted medical technology that could treat injuries that would be fatal by human standards. And they wanted, with absolute seriousness, better coffee than the synthetic versions available through galactic trade networks. Because apparently, humanity's soldiers had been fighting on substandard caffeine, and were quite upset about it. The Confederation, recognizing that denying requests from the species currently protecting everyone's core worlds would be diplomatically unwise, and potentially hazardous to continued existence, agreed to all terms. The coffee request took longest to fulfill because nobody had anticipated that human agricultural preferences would become a strategic priority. But eventually 3 different worlds began cultivating Earth coffee plants with the kind of care typically reserved for endangered species preservation. The war itself changed fundamentally after the Battle of the Forgotten Nexus, which was the official name that stuck despite multiple attempts to call it something more dignified. The Confederation's military doctrine absorbed human tactics, with the enthusiasm of organizations desperate for anything that worked. Drekkan dreadnoughts began carrying contingency munitions, which was polite terminology for things we can deliberately explode, if we need to. Nexari drone swarms started incorporating irrational probability actions into their programming, which meant sometimes they did things that made no tactical sense just to confuse the enemy. Feldorian phase shift cruisers experimented with aggressive boarding prevention, which involved explosive decompression, and was described in official reports as the human approach to uninvited guests. The Voidborn, encountering this new doctrine across multiple sectors simultaneously, began experiencing what Confederation analysts clinically described as strategic confusion, and what human observers called, "Oh look, they hate." The entity that had been steadily consuming the galaxy for a decade suddenly found itself fighting enemies who would not behave predictably, would not preserve forces when disadvantaged, and absolutely refused to acknowledge that some battles were unwinnable. The war that military projections suggested would last 3 more years ended in 11 months. The Voidborn Collective, faced with opponents who had learned humanity's fundamental lesson about the strategic value of absolute commitment, simply could not adapt fast enough. The entity's final fleet was destroyed in the outer reaches, coincidentally in the same sector where humanity had made their stand, by a combined Confederation force that included human vessels, Drekkan dreadnoughts, Nexari swarm, and Feldorian cruisers, all employing tactics that would have been considered unthinkable 2 years earlier. Commander Huang, now holding the title of Supreme Allied Commander despite humanity's continued classification as barely Type 2, attended the victory celebration on the Ayatari homeworld. She stood among beings of pure energy, ancient reptilian warriors, hive minds that processed reality itself, and aquatic philosophers, all of them celebrating the end of an existential threat. When asked to provide remarks for the historical record, she offered observations that the Ayatari would spend the next century contemplating. "We did not save the galaxy because we were advanced. We saved it because we were too primitive to know we should have lost." Sometimes the species that does not understand the odds has an advantage over species that do. The galaxy's strategic paradigm had shifted permanently. Humanity no longer occupied the bottom of the Confederation's hierarchy, though their official classification remained Type 2.1 pending committee review that would probably take 15 years. Earth's fleet patrolled the wormhole nexus with the same paranoid thoroughness that had saved civilization, still preparing for threats that probability suggested would never arrive. Human military advisors were attached to Confederation fleets across 12 sectors, teaching ancient warrior species the tactical applications of stubbornness. Human colony vessels were establishing settlements on worlds throughout the Confederation, spreading humanity's particular brand of chaos to previously orderly civilization. Xthor, the Drekkan liaison officer, who had observed humanity's entire improbable journey, from irrelevant newcomers to galactic saviors, filed his final report with observations that would define humanity's role in Confederation culture. "I do not understand human. I have observed them for 2 years, fought beside them, watched them achieve impossible victories through impossible means. I understand them less now than when I began, but I have concluded this is acceptable, perhaps even preferable.
A species that can be fully understood cannot surprise you. And humanity's greatest tactical advantage appears to be their infinite capacity for surprise. 3 years after the war's end, the Confederation's military academies added mandatory courses in human tactical doctrine. Though instructors struggled to explain concepts like Murphy's Law and hold my beer and watch this to species that processed reality through quantum mathematics and philosophical framework, the courses remained popular despite, or perhaps because of, their tendency to give visiting Ayatari energy beings what looked suspiciously like headaches. And in the outer reaches, on a mining station that had been destroyed and rebuilt 3 times, humanity continued their patrol with the same intensity they had brought to that first impossible battle. Because they had learned something the galaxy had forgotten over 7,000 years of civilization. The universe did not care about your technological classification, your cultural sophistication, or your strategic projection. The universe cared about who was willing to stand their ground when everything suggested they should run, who would fight when all tactical analysis said they should surrender, and who possessed enough creative spite to turn mining equipment into weapons of mass destruction. The Confederation had been running the galaxy with efficiency and order for 7 millennia. Humanity had been part of that galaxy for less than 1% of that time, and yet, when existence itself was threatened, it was the primitive species with chemical rockets and mass drivers, who refused to lose, who adapted faster than quantum computers, who somehow convinced the rest of the galaxy that impossible victories were just victories nobody had tried hard enough to achieve. The war had changed everything. The galactic hierarchy would never look the same. Military doctrine had been revolutionized. Humanity's position in the Confederation was permanently elevated. But perhaps most importantly, every species in known space now understood a fundamental truth that humans had known all along. In a universe that constantly tried to kill you, the only rational response was to be too stubborn to die and too creative to fight fair. And if that meant turning cargo vessels into weapons, using furniture as projectiles, or establishing defensive positions at locations that defended nothing while simultaneously defending everything, then humanity would do exactly that, with enthusiasm and absolutely no apology. The galaxy had learned to stop patronizing the primitive species from Earth. The galaxy had learned to respect their tactical innovations. The galaxy had learned that sometimes, the newest member of galactic civilization could teach the oldest species lessons about survival, but mostly, the galaxy had learned to never, ever give humans a posting they described as strategically irrelevant, because humanity would inevitably turn it into the most important location in known space through sheer determination, and what the Draken clinically diagnosed as weaponized overconfidence. The Ayatari, in their infinite energy being wisdom, eventually materialized to offer one final observation that summarized humanity's impact on galactic civilization. We have contemplated existence for 4,000 years. Humanity has contemplated existence for approximately 5 minutes, and yet they have taught us more about survival in 2 years than we learned in 4 millennia. This is either profound wisdom or cosmic irony. We suspect it is both.